All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of The Big Ben Show. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can follow me on X at BDomenech. Follow the show at Big Ben Show Fox on X and on Instagram. I'm back on Instagram too at BT Domenech. And I want to talk to you today about some of the things that are affecting the conversation on the American right that I believe we all should be pretty worried about. It's very possible that what we are witnessing going on right now, a year into Donald Trump's second term, is the beginnings of a MAGA crack-up that a lot of people have been anticipating for a long time, and anticipating, I think, with good reason, in terms of their understanding of what would happen after Donald Trump was no longer on the ballot, was no longer in the contest effectively when it comes to American elections. And in his absence, the possibility of having the different members of the coalition fray and go back and forth to try to assert themselves over other members of the coalition, try to dictate who the next leaders of this MAGA coalition are, and try to redefine the America First foreign policy that the president has advocated for consistently as president. Try to redefine it in ways that appeal more to their own priorities as opposed to what the voters expect. There's a number of elements that go into this, and I think that you can include the media conversation that's happening on the right, where you have all the different people who have prominence are at each other's throats over different aspects of policy, whether it be arguments about Israel and anti-Semitism, arguments about cancel culture and free speech, arguments about how much effort or how much time should be devoted to reaching a lot of younger people who have beliefs that could frankly be described as pretty radical and extreme, or whether this is going to be a coalition even at all that can hold together after Donald Trump is no longer the head of it effectively politically. J.D. Vance obviously is the person who stands as the likeliest person to inherit this coalition. And he, in the aftermath of the recent Virginia elections, posted on X about his own concerns about the need to work together and that they should be devolving the kind of infighting within these different factions of the right as much as possible, finding more unity. That's fine for an ex post, but I don't know what the vice president is doing thus far to actually ensure that that's something that happens, or if it's even something that he can do given everything that's on his plate. What I do know is that when you survey the MAGA coalition right now, you have the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene getting strange new respect. You have the conversation over true racism and anti-Semitism spilling over into the halls of think tanks and fights happening with figures of varying degrees of positions of leadership on the right, both institutionally and in the media landscape, and politicians themselves. It's not a good situation considering that this is a year which has been enormously successful by any measure for the president of the United States. Whenever you have a president who is very reasonably receiving consideration as someone who could get nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, you know that he's doing a good job. And yet you hear some voices that are out there who saying effectively, the problem is the president's spending too much time on foreign policy. Well, he's been more successful on that, I would argue, to this point than he has on domestic policy, in large part because so much of the domestic policies have been set via executive order and the like, and not the kind of legislation that we would like to see. But still, it's just a marked example of the kind of legacy that he's going to have that even his critics admit how well things have gone in terms of redirecting the situation in the Middle East, in terms of finding resolutions to many intractable problems under the Biden administration. The president has proven to be very effective, and his team has been very effective, including Vance, of course, but also Rubio, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and others who are around him at this moment. That's all to the good. The bad side of things, I think, is that people are just frustrated about the lack of a right-of-center response to issues of affordability. And the president runs the risk of sounding a lot like Joe Biden when he talks about this not being a problem and about, Thanksgiving and Christmas being cheaper than they were before. about how well things are going, and that essentially this is a media narrative that says that things are unaffordable. But we know that this is something that Democrats are leaning into, and that many of the working class voters who Donald Trump counted on and who he brought into the coalition have concerns about this as well, especially at the end of the year when people are looking at their budgets about how big of a Christmas they can afford to have. Frankly, I think this is a situation that requires a lot more leadership than just Donald Trump. It requires Republicans to talk about affordability issues, I think, in a much more nuanced way, to essentially understand where people are coming from when they talk about it, but also not be afraid to say the hard truths about how bad this economy has been. I know the president doesn't like it when people talk about this kind of thing, but the stock market is not the economy. And you have to, I think, keep in mind the levels of burden that many families are experiencing and just the expectations that are put upon them as members of the middle class in America today. Look, I think that this is a very solid team. It's a cabinet clearly that has more loyalty and less affinity for leaking things to the press than he did in his first term. The people who surrounded him back then were far less loyal, far less competent than the people who surround him now. But it's incumbent upon them to recognize that this coalition is fragile, that it could be broken apart pretty easily by having the types of concerns that motivated people to get into it in the first place essentially be ones that are cast aside or viewed as secondary to interests that matter more to, say, Silicon Valley or the tech people who've been brought into the coalition or the crypto bros or the global kind of minded people who care about issues that are frankly not the core issues that motivated people to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. He brought together a scattered coalition by finding different issues that cut across the perspectives of people that opened them up to making a partisan shift. But keeping that together, I think, is going to require real leadership. And right now, it's essentially held together with duct tape and bits of twine. I'm Ben Domenech. You're listening to another edition of The Big Ben Show. Follow us on X and on Instagram at Big Ben Show Fox. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back to the Big Ben Show. Happy to be joined today in studio by Mariam Wahba. She is a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. You can follow her on X at the Mariam Wahba. That's WAHBA on X. Mariam, thanks so much for joining me in studio today. I wanted to talk to you about the conversation that has generally trickled, I think, into the awareness of most people who watch Fox or who pay attention to the news regarding the focus on what's been going on in Nigeria. I know that this is something that FDD has a program now that's focusing on the persecution of Christians in many parts of the world. Tell me a little bit about what's going on in Nigeria, why it has received the kind of focus that it has in recent weeks, and your thoughts on what the president is doing when he's talking about it lately.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you today. Thank you for having me. Look, we've seen Nigeria be catapulted into media headlines and national headlines over the last few days, but really over the last few weeks, we've seen that spike hit. And obviously it's due to POTUS's mentioning it in the Truth Post about the Christian persecution that's happening in Nigeria. But I think the story is much more nuanced and complicated than just that POTUS Truth Post. So Christian persecution happens all over Africa, all over the Middle East. Unfortunately, doesn't get as much attention. I can speak anecdotally, being a Coptic Christian myself and being part of a persecuted Christian community, on just how little the issue gets covered and how exciting it is when it does get attention, especially from the sitting president of the United States. The Nigeria issue has been happening for decades now. We've seen Christian attacks by Islamic, traditional or classical, for a lack of a better word, Islamist groups and non-Islamist groups. And here I'll make this distinction that I think is getting lost in the conversation that's happening is you have, again, for a lack of a better term, your classical Islamists, meaning ISIS, Boko Haram, ISWAP, the Islamic State. And those are active in Nigeria. And we're talking about a governance issue. The government is having a hard time dealing with these militant Islamists. And then you have this other bucket of Christian persecution that's happening, and it's what the president was talking about. And it's these Fulani herders that are attacking the Christian farmers. And I think that's where the story starts here.
Tell me in terms of the history of this, because I think people may have had this on their radar a little bit, but they may not know the history. What's been going on there in the last few years that has led up to this particular moment in terms of rising levels of attack, rising levels of violence? What are the different factors that go into this?
Absolutely. And look, one thing I'm realizing as I'm seeing all the reporting come out on this issue is there's a lot of folks contesting the issue instead of choosing to accept that it is an issue, and then let's get our facts straight. Ted Cruz has been outspoken about this issue and has thrown out several numbers gathered by Nigerian and other think tanks and people who collect data. And I think the numbers were something like in the last year, more than 7,000 Christians have been murdered. In the last maybe 2 decades, we're looking at 52,000 Christians. Some numbers put it as high as 100,000. And obviously, it's really hard to keep track of those numbers in a country that is not as watched as, let's say, a country in the Middle East or on our side of the hemisphere. When it comes to understanding the complicated history of it, I think what is important for us to focus on this issue is the folks contesting whether it's Christian persecution or not are focused on the fact that it's a herder-farmer dynamic. And just because there is this other sectarian element to it, meaning the herders are majority Muslim and the farmers are majority Christian, doesn't mean it's not Christian persecution. When you have most of your casualties being Christians, I think it would be hard to say that it isn't Christian persecution. And then we can get into the dynamics of what are the Nigerian laws, the grazing laws that ended up making it so that the Muslim Fulani herders have a reason to attack the Christian farmers. And I think this is really like the crux of the issue that is being missed in a lot of the reporting that's happening at the moment.
So tell me about that. What are sort of the flare-up points that lead to these? And you know, I think one thing to just in terms of your perspective on this violence, is this an organic and repetitive thing, or are these targeted incidents where you have a perpetual sort of risk of violence for these Christians, just given the natural inclination of those that they are having incidents with or running into various challenges that come up in the course of them farming in the area?
Right. I think that's a great question. And for a sec, I want us to put aside that first bucket of your classic Islamist jihadists, sure, the ISIS, the Boko Haram, the ISWAPs. Let's forget about them for a sec, although that is a threat and it is a failure of the Nigerian government for not being able to address the Islamist threat. I want to focus on the Fulani herder and Christian farmer dynamic that's happening. The history is long, but I think in 2017 there was this law that attempted to curb some of the violence that was being perpetrated by the Fulani herders, because the Fulani herders naturally wanted their and this is a little nuanced here, so stay with me, wanted their cattle to be able to graze openly on farmland. And of course, that's a threat to the farmland owned by the Christian farmers. So there was this law that attempted to limit the amount or the scale of grazing that was to be done by cattle hordes and by the Fulani Muslim community. The law was not effective because, again, governance issues within the Nigerian government being unable to address this issue properly. So then you have the Fulani Muslim community continuing to allow their cattle hordes to graze on Christian farms. And that, I mean, now we're talking about livelihoods, right? These are people farming, and then there's cattle herders, and they're threatening each other's livelihoods. And I remember there was this one story back during the Biden days where people attempted to boil down this issue to an issue of climate change, which I thought was just a little ridiculous. Anyway, so the law was not effective, and it essentially brought things to a tipping point because the Fulani Muslim herder community saw it as an existential crisis, which it was, and in effect began to arm themselves. And what we're seeing in most recent days is there's really like militia level organization by the Fulani Muslim herder community attacking the Christians. So this is really how in the weeds we are with understanding what exactly is happening on the ground.
The attitudes of U.S. policymakers on this, you mentioned Ted Cruz being one that had put it forward as being an important issue. What have they done, if anything, to raise this as something that the United States should, play a role in? And why is it that this is something that there is a deep feeling of, that the United States has some role, just given what's going on, and given, quite frankly, that, as you say, this is happening in a country that's less prominent in terms of the American global interests than others where we have a lot of attention being paid at the moment.
Yeah. Look, religious freedom has always been an agenda item of the Trump administration. Look back to Trump 1.0, you'll see it was let's call it a pillar of their foreign policy. I remember then Vice President Mike Pence would appear to a lot of the Christian persecution events that here in D.C. So I don't see this as particularly coming out of left field for Trump 2.0. I get we're 9 months into the second administration and we're just seeing it come into effect. But it is a important thing to the president, and therefore his political allies, it seems like it's important for them too. When it comes to policy, I think the most important thing that we're seeing happen is the designation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern. And that is a recommendation that United States Commission on International Religious Freedom makes every year in the report. They make a list of countries that they, based on their findings, suggest should be a CPC. And then the POTUS and the State Department either can take that recommendation or doesn't take that recommendation.
What explain for our listeners what that designation means practically.
Absolutely. It opens up the country listed or designated as a CPC, a country of particular concern, and there's a couple of other designations as well. It opens them up for more scrutiny and practically more sanctions based on religious freedom rights. And I think it's an important leverage point for the United States government when interacting bilaterally with these nations. Mm-hmm.
The actual designation, though, doesn't necessarily come with a clear policy ramification. The president, as is his wont, has talked about airstrikes. There's been, some other things bandied about in the media. What, from your perspective, should be the actual policy going forward? If this is something that rises above the level of a humanitarian tragedy like so many that we see around the world, why is it, and what are the actual practical steps that could be done in order to influence things for the better in Nigeria?
Okay. Well, when it comes to our posturing on specifically an issue like religious freedom, I think of course, there's the humanitarian, altruistic element of it, of we're the United States of America and we should give a damn about. Yeah. We should care about this issue. Okay, sorry. We should care about this issue because it's an important issue to care about. I think more practically from a policy perspective, any time that we see Islamist, jihadist, or really any militant actor that is focused on an area or group of people, they don't stop there. I mean, Look at any other part of the world. Look at Hamas. You think they were done after October 7th? No, if they were successful in infiltrating Israel properly, they would have started looking at the next border they can infiltrate. So these things do not contain themselves. Islamist groups are not particularly known for having a set goal, achieving it, and kind of calling their days. So, and then you talk about Nigeria is a U.S. ally, and we should not want any of our allies to slip into such poor governance. And I could ramble on here, but I won't. So that's the policy perspective of it. Now, what do we do? I think the CPC designation was a great start. I think where we should be, where the United States government should be in the moment, is fact-fighting. We need to understand the facts on the ground, and we need to understand them fast because we have all these numbers being thrown out, 7,000, 50,000 since 2009. And I think there's going to be a lot of noise. I mean, like we were saying, talk about how it's being covered. People are more interested in denying that it's a problem than actually trying to understand the facts. So we should be in fact-finding mode. And then when it comes to airstrikes, look, I'll speak anecdotally here. I come from the Coptic Christian community of Egypt. I've been in some sticky situations. And in those sticky situations, I would have loved nothing more than an airstrike to come and kill some Islamist terrorists. But practically speaking, I think airstrikes here are probably one or two steps removed from reality. Nigeria, in central Nigeria where this is happening, it would be hard for me to imagine an airstrike solving this problem.
Yeah. I also think that there's way more potential for blowback in this situation like this. Tragically, one of the things that makes the president's policies when it comes to speedboats and things like that currently in international waters is that no one with a brain can look at that boat and say that's a fisherman. But the problem is that when it comes to adjudicating something like this, I think awareness of what's going on the ground is very low in terms of at least my impression of what the government sees there. One thing that I do think, though, is clear is that a lot of the president's Christian supporters do care about this issue, and it seems to be the one where he is now paying attention to it. But this also is happening within the context of a conversation on the right among a lot of different people about how much of a footprint the United States has overseas, how they exert power, what that should be done, what that should look like, how we should deploy our military resources and the like, and what we should expect of them in terms of having some humility about what they can do. Do you view Nigeria as being a situation that could perhaps be a test case for what that looks like, having a positive influence potentially in trying to tamp down on this conflict that has very real body counts, but doing so potentially in an area that doesn't overcommit U.S. resources or squander them or result in the worst case scenario for most of the president's supporters, which is American boots on the ground or something like that?
What an interesting question. I think the short answer is yes. I mean, all of these little things happening on in Trump 2.0 are test cases in themselves. And I think what the Trump, and of course we understand that President Trump is a master negotiator and he starts from a aggressive position, let's call it, and hopes to work his way into a more reasonable position. I think what's worrying for me about this is how unreceptive the Nigerian government has been about this issue. Acknowledge you have a problem, ask for help, or rather accept the help that's being offered to you, and let's move together as allies.
I'll be curious to see what's done in this area, because it seems to me like a smaller test case, just by comparison to the other things that are on the president's plate when it comes to what his foreign policy looks like. Let's go out on this. You mentioned your experience as a Coptic Christian and yourself born and raised in Egypt. This is obviously a moment when a lot of people are paying attention to the experience of Christians in the Middle East and the relationships, potentially the negative relationships they have with a lot of other forces and governments around them. What kind of support does the United States need to be offering for those Christians in the Middle East currently? And what can we do to better improve their way of life by either exerting pressure on some of our allies who frankly owe us in the region currently for a lot of different things, or just trying to use some soft power diplomatically to try to deal with some of the problems that they face?
Wow, I couldn't have put it better myself. Look, with the Middle East particularly is hot at the moment, let's say, and the president is all about wins. I think when it comes to better improving how we do this issue better, how we do this Christian persecution issue better, I think and I hate to use this term, but it's about representation. When we teach our diplomats, when we talk in the State Department, and I've been in those rooms, I've been in those meetings, about religious freedom, it has always been a periphery issue. Meaning you sit down with our diplomats, our leaders sit down with the Egyptians, they talk about the Egyptian economy, they talk about the military, they talk about defense pacts. And then when they get to it, they could talk about the 10 million Coptic Christians that are being persecuted, and maybe it's a lower tier diplomat that does it, or they leave it to the USERF, the United States Commissions. I think we need to center the issue more. So on the agenda, of course, defense is first, pacts are first, economies first. And then maybe number 4 or 5 is let's talk about your 10 million Christians and how they're being treated. Let's talk about the fact that the law, the codified law of these countries treats these people as second-class citizens, if that. So by centering the issue, you signal to our allies, to the people we give billions of dollars to in aid, that this is an issue we care about instead of this afterthought that we'll get to when we get to.
You can follow Mariam Wahba on X at the Mariam Wahba. She is a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mariam, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back with more of The Big Ben Show right after this. And we're back on the Big Ben Show. Happy to welcome now Michael Sobolik. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and author of Countering China's Great Game. You can follow him on X at Michael Sobolik. That's Sobolik. Thanks so much, Michael, for taking the time to join us in studio today. I wanted to get an update from you on a number of different fronts, but let's start big picture. Looking at this Trump administration, the second Trump administration, through the bulk of its first year, has this administration been softer on China than you expected it to be?
Yes. In many ways, I think it has. And I think it's important, number one, to get some context, because in the president's first term, there was this huge discourse about how mercurial and unpredictable Donald Trump is. And it's interesting, for all of that, which is totally true, on a few small issues, he's been incredibly consistent. One, throughout his entire public life preceding politics, was that Iran should never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. The second is his affinity for tariffs. And I guess more broadly, his belief that the United States has been ripped off economically by a lot of people. And that second belief, core belief for Donald Trump, drives a lot of his foreign policy, including his China policy. And in much of his first term, he was doing then what he's trying to do now, which is get a trade deal with China. And he got the phase one deal in like January or February 2020. And then we all know what happened in 2020. And the pandemic upended everything. Then Biden never really enforced that deal. So now he's back. And surprise, he wants his trade deal again. He wants it enforced, and he wants it bigger and better than the previous time. But there was also this added expectation that because of everything that happened in 2020 and China's culpability, specifically the Chinese Communist Party's culpability for COVID, that he would do in 2025 what he did in 2020, which is go pedal to the metal and lean into this confrontational policy stance. But I mean, Ben, you're right. I was expecting that, particularly with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. At the time, Mike Waltz was announced National Security Advisor. You had a number of other China hawks in the administration. And with a few notable exceptions, which maybe we can get into, like critical minerals, like what they've been very forward leaning on. But on a lot of things, I actually have been a bit surprised on that.
Let's talk through some of those different issues and what might make them stick out to you. Let's start with one that was obviously telegraphed during the election, in part to appeal to his own domestic political priorities. We saw a total shift in the way that Donald Trump talked about TikTok. And it certainly, became well in evidence that despite the fact that the Congress had passed this law, that this had been something that the president had argued for at the time, that he had supported at the time, and that he, contended was a malign, element of China's influence over American domestic politics and culture. Turns out that lots of young people like it, and they make funny videos of him on it, and he liked that. And then there were some, frankly, very interested parties, including among some of his supporters from Silicon Valley, and very wealthy ones at that, who wanted a chance to own a piece of TikTok, if not the whole thing. How that shook out, from my perspective, was one of the maybe not in the scheme of things matters as much in terms of some of the positioning that we can get into when it comes to the global perspective and South Asia. But it's one thing that I think was so prominent because people had expected the opposite, that when it became clear he was going to take a different perspective, it raised a lot of different questions about, okay, is this time around going to be different when it comes to China? Why do you think ultimately the president made the decision that he did? Were you surprised that more Republicans didn't raise hell about it, especially the ones who warned about TikTok's negative effects, regardless of whether it's the Chinese using it? And how satisfied are you with the deal that ultimately came to be?
Not surprised, but disappointed, surely. So it all comes down to politics in large part, which is not a new story, but it's an unfortunate story in this context. So you already mentioned the donor aspect. You mentioned the youth aspect, and that electorally was critical for Donald Trump. He performed noticeably better with Gen Z and just young voters than other GOP candidates have recently. And that, unfortunately, has eclipsed all of the national security problems with the Chinese Communist Party owning one of the most popular apps in America. Never would have let the Soviets do this with ABC News or CBS or anything during the Cold War. And Congress passed the law to update that huge loophole in 2024. And the president just flipped. And it was more than flipping. There's some concerns about just non-enforcement of a law that Congress duly passed, Supreme Court unanimously upheld. But yeah, like it's a real problem because we've seen even with the trade war, TikTok being leveraged by Beijing to pump content that's favorable towards China position on trade in the middle of the tit-for-tat tariff escalation this summer. And that doesn't even get into the October 7th anti-Semitic spike, pro-Hamas content that we saw in late 2023. The evidence of TikTok being a vector of Beijing's influence continues to accumulate. And even when it targeted Donald Trump's biggest priority with trade, it just didn't register and his position hasn't changed. And you asked about the deal itself. I'm not optimistic at all.
And maybe talk about that, because I think people who don't understand, see a deal like this and they just automatically react to it the way so many people react to things that the Trump administration does, which is based on their level of trust of the people involved. But what is your problem with the deal as it stands?
It's rational to trust someone who's demonstrated trustworthiness. With this deal, we're essentially trusting the Chinese Communist Party. And the rub in this is the algorithm is licensed from TikTok's Chinese parent company. And without getting into the weeds of all that stuff, like if you license something from someone else, you don't own it and you don't control it. That other person does. Yeah. And why would we allow ByteDance, which is a Chinese company controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, to control this algorithm? It's unsafe. It's dangerous. TikTok is used to divide Americans against each other, which is incidentally what Beijing wants to achieve. So they're not a demonstrated trustworthy partner at all.
One last TikTok question before we move to other things. What level of influence do you believe was put in place there in boosting the campaign in New York of Zohran Mamdani?
I've seen really compelling evidence from this. It was this organization, I think, called Spring AI.
Yes.
They demonstrated evidence in the algorithm of boosting Mamdani. And it's another data point, very recent data point. And if you look at his positions on issues that I think should be concerning to anyone who is supportive of President Trump or even just a conservative, it's a red flag.
Yeah. I think that this is going to continually be a problem going forward. And it seems very, odd to me that this was something where just you can give it up based on the different factors involved. Let's shift to some of the other areas. You mentioned that they have been aggressive when it comes to some of the rare earth fights, some of the other mineral-related fights. How is that currently shaking out, and what do you think the end game really is there for this administration?
I think this is where the Trump administration actually doesn't get enough credit for foreign policy. Donald Trump is often talked about as someone who doesn't have a lot of respect for allies and partners, stuff like that. But if you actually look at his attempt to solve this issue where China controls almost the entirety of refined rare earth elements, which when we say that, basically the very specific kinds of metals and minerals that we need in like our washing machines and our cars and our fighter jets, like everything, basically, China has a chokehold on the supply chain. And Donald Trump is not just trying to fix this problem alone. He's going to the Australians and the Japanese in this recent trip he took out to East Asia where he met with Xi Jinping. And he is getting allies either to invest in our own rare earth industry here at home, or he's also looking at what they have in their own countries and getting new supply chains, which is great. We need to be helping each other because it's a global problem. We aren't the only ones who have this problem. Like everybody does.
The other area that I really wanted to talk to you about as it relates to expectations and matching what we saw going into this admin is really our relationship with our allies in the region, many of which are very concerned about the continued encroachment upon their own sovereignty by China in so many different respects. What's your grade for what the admin has been doing thus far, especially considering that they've spent a lot of time focusing on things that they obviously didn't necessarily plan on focusing on when they began the run for Trump 2.0. Namely that they've had to focus on the Middle East a lot more than I think they thought they were going to have to. I think that they've run into a lot of frustrations when it comes to resolving the war in Ukraine that perhaps they were a little too overly optimistic about, or at least the president was. Do you think that they have kept their eye on the ball when it comes to their relationships with our allies in the region vis-a-vis China?
I actually do. Okay. So I guess a couple of thoughts. Number one, going after the Iranian nuclear program actually made our allies in Asia more secure, because that's a great deterrent message to send to Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. So that rebounded positively. And if you look at his trip to Korea and Japan just a couple of weeks ago, both the Koreans and the Japanese were overwhelmingly pleased and happy with those visits from Trump. He promised nuclear-powered subs to the Koreans, which is a huge message, not just to Kim Jong-un, but also to Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. And the Japanese and the Americans seem to be getting on very well, and they're leaning in more into the importance of Taiwan's security, which they have not done in this level historically. Mm-hmm. So they're feeling emboldened from us, which is good, and I think they're feeling secure right now.
What's their biggest concern in terms of addressing issues that we haven't perhaps lived up to yet as it relates to military supplying and the kind of things that they would like to get from us or buy from us that maybe don't exactly match up with what we think they ought to have, or don't match up with what we think they need? What's your perspective on their attitude about that? So
South Korea has this very understandable problem of being like, are the Americans really actually going to come to our defense in a nuclear war with North Korea? Like, can we really trust you guys? Mm-hmm. So there's always that give and take, and that's going to be a slow process of figuring it out. But the message of actually saying we're going to give you guys nuclear powered subs, huge reassurance, I think. This is a real problem, though, Ben, with Taiwan, because historically they have wanted flashy top-end platforms when they really need asymmetric, cheap things that can be survivable. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, Taipei is starting to get it. And the Trump administration, actually, the problem is on our side now, because there's this huge backlog of arms sales to Taiwan, which one could speculate the backlog is there to not make China angry, which I think is a problem.
Talk to me about the defense of Taiwan a bit. The thing that I've heard, Palmer Luckey obviously talks about this in a certain way, but others do as well, about the difference in what we're supplying them now, assuming that when a conflict comes, unlike with Ukraine, where you could rush things across to them quickly, you're not going to be able to do that, and that China will really have control of what gets into them, and in a very negative way, unless we want to truly get involved in that conflict. So how you prepare for it now matters a great deal. One aspect of this that seems critical to me is the question of what they are given when it comes to drone warfare, and that when you look at these larger drones, certainly very impressive, that come from major developers, they require an enormous amount of material, large factories to produce, et cetera, et cetera. And the argument, obviously, it's in his interest, because it's what his company makes. But the argument that somebody like Palmer Luckey advances is, right now, if you look at Taiwan, the things that they make there include, they are enormous manufacturers of bicycles. That they just churn them out, and they can build them very quickly with all these different carbon fiber things that they've already set up, and et cetera. And his basic argument is, I want to be able to give them a drone program that they can make in a bicycle plant that is essentially, it's simpler, it's faster, and it doesn't require the kind of huge build out that you saw, that you see in so many other respects. And the comparison obviously being to look at something like what happened during the World War II experience for America, where we all know and are aware of the fact that the big car manufacturers just turned around and started making airplanes and started doing a lot of other things that they weren't doing before. But those plants were already here, and that's so they rushed stuff through that really was we're using a car plant to make something that it wasn't really built to make. And that's something that is applied to the Taiwan experience, seems to be an interesting lesson. How much is that something that is getting through to the process of what they're actually being given? as opposed to just throwing money at, basically whatever they want. They regardless of whether it makes sense in terms of a defense militarily, it's just people just saying throw as much money as you can at a problem, which seems both wasteful but also backwards and foolish in terms of getting involved in the conflict.
You need quantity and quality. You need both. And the quantity side, I'm not terribly worried about, because you can manufacture a ton of drones and do it fairly reasonably. The trick is going to be, can you do it on those pre-existing factory floors, which I think Palmer is absolutely right about that. We did that in World War II to great effect. The Taiwanese should do it too. They need to be integrated with advanced artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Because that is exactly what China is doing with their drones. So however we make them, we got to make them efficiently, but they need to be at that high level of AI warfare that China is. And I guess the final thing I'll say, this can rebound to America's benefit too, because listen, that should be made in Taiwan. We don't want those drones made somewhere else and then shipped over there, because they won't be able to get there in a conflict. But if Taiwan can do that, hey, maybe we can start buying some drones from Taiwan as well, and we get something out of it too.
Do you think that the folks on Capitol Hill understand this issue to a good degree? Or, again, this is one of those eye off the ball kind of things. We hear so much more from politicians, obviously, lately about Israel, and before that about Ukraine, and less about Taiwan. My concern has been, for many years now, that the potential for conflict very high, and the level of attention being paid to it, at least by some of our more prominent politicians, far lower than it ought to be.
I generally share those concerns. However, I will say Roger Wicker, I think maybe more than anyone else in the Senate, has his eye on this problem. I think he was actually in Taiwan recently.
Yes.
And he gets it. And also, just as a former Senate staffer, I remember working with a lot of those staff members on the Armed Services Committee, where no matter what the news cycle was, it was their job to ignore it and focus on their remit. And he's got great people doing that. So I'm happy that Chairman Wicker is focused, and I also don't think he's the only one.
Do you generally feel like this administration is going to be able to shift things around when it comes to the Department of War's attitude towards procurement? We've seen some of the comments that Pete Hegseth has made, publicly, and the president has certainly made, about the need to fix so many problems. And yet, at the same time, when I talk to people, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we just don't have the institutional knowledge anymore to build the kind of things that we need to be building at the level of manpower that is necessary. And so we hear about falling behind when it comes to naval power, when it comes to submarines, when it comes to everything else. Do you think this administration, in the time that they have, are going to be able to fix this problem? Or is this one of these things where it's going to be on a hypothetical J.D. Vance or something like that to follow on with this? Because it doesn't necessarily seem to me like a problem that can be fixed that quickly.
The next president will be dealing with this problem too.
Yeah.
I do think that the Trump administration can fix, or at least get insanely close to fixing, the rare earth mineral problem in this term. They won't be able to fix this, but they can lay the foundation for the next administration.
Let's talk a bit about the influence campaigns that don't necessarily involve TikTok. You have a letter, which is really congratulations on getting an op-ed length letter in the Wall Street Journal, because I've only done that once before in my life, in terms of, they take, a big chunk of it, about the current conflagration within the American right, about perspectives on foreign policy. And you, I think, correctly point out that one issue that isn't getting brought up in this context as much as it ought to be is China. Tell me a little bit about why.
So Nick Fuentes is unfortunately in the news, as is Tucker Carlson. And the issue, I guess the conversation of the moment, is anti-Semitism and what that means for the conservative movement on, do we need people who listen to Nick Fuentes to win politically? But there's a bigger problem than just anti-Semitism, as horrific and evil as that is. Nick Fuentes has a penchant for just authoritarianism and dictators in general. And there's this one quote that he said on his show, in recent years about how we should invite the People's Liberation Army from China to New York to do to African Americans what they do to Uyghurs.
Oh my gosh.
Horrific, vile stuff.
The thing about Fuentes is, his subtlety. I want to pursue the point that you made in the letter. But one thing that I think is very odd about this moment politically is that, I remember years back when the frustration in the first Obama term, heard by and vocalized by so many, even in the pages of the New York Times and the like, was, this is just a broken democratic system. It's not something that can actually meet the moment. If only we could be China for a day. And now it really does seem like the right vocalizes that a lot more than the left. The left vocalizes it in economic terms, but when it comes to the kind of, I wish we could just sweep all this away and build everything kind of attitude, I understand it on a certain level. I'm sure that if you're trying to build homes in Los Angeles or something like that, you may feel that way because they might actually be to the right of some of the people you have to deal with. But it's a very dangerous thing. Why do you think that has shifted?
Wait, real quick, was that Tom Friedman who had that China for a day thing?
Yes.
Oh, yes, Tom Friedman. So, on the right, I think there's been this longstanding frustration. Like, I grew up listening to Rush, so many people did.
Me too.
And there was this, I think, understandable frustration at the Republican establishment elite who weren't actually serious about governing conservatively. And then that resulted in the Tea Party during the Barack Obama years. And then Trump came in of being someone who doesn't mind being a wrecking ball. But there are a lot of people who have entered the coalition that not only want to take a wrecking ball to progressivism, but I think have this existential fear of losing the country. Mm-hmm. And which is understandable, but if your response to losing the country is to ditch the Constitution in order to save the Constitution, that might be a good movie plot, but it doesn't make sense in reality. Mm-hmm. Conservatives actually need to conserve something, and I think it comes from that fundamental fear of losing the political debate for the soul of America, and in the process, viewing people who you disagree with as either un-American or dehumanizing them. And that's where I see a lot of our politics going. Nick Fuentes is the poster child of this, and someone like Tucker is laundering those positions, vile positions, into the conservative movement. Not conservative positions at all, but he's doing it. And I think it's a huge problem, not just on the Israel question or the anti-Semitism question, but even the big foreign policy issue of our lifetimes, which is China. That threat is there too, which is what my letter was all about.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the elements of this you are correctly diagnosing is that people see the current landscape in America as intractable and as laden with bureaucracy everywhere. And so the temptation is to look overseas at some of these authoritarian regimes, whether it's the train system in Russia, for certain people, or whether it's, the building capabilities that China has, and admire it and even, envy it on some level because, look at what you can do. I think that the problem is fundamentally that they don't wrestle with, or they don't deal with the consequence of sort of saying, well, one of the things that we have to do within a representative, republic, is to have the process of working through these things. The Constitution is not the barrier to doing big things. We've done incredible big things in the past. The problems that are affecting communities and that are preventing us from doing those kinds of things now, it is something that has a lot more to do with local decision-making, bureaucracy, and monopartisan democratic control in many of these areas, particularly California, obviously, but New York as well. And, Trump's builder instincts kind of cut to that. But I don't think that what follows from that is, well, we should just sweep away everything that got us to be able to do these kinds of things, or to have the intelligence to do them that is the envy of the world. We should be sweeping away the bureaucracy and the barriers to building and the barriers to creating, as opposed to that.
I wish this problem was just on the far right, but Hassam Piker
Yes.
is in China like right now, and he's streamed from...
he's there right now?
Right now.
Okay.
He's streamed from Tiananmen Square within the past 24 hours. Same guy who at Zoran Mondami's victory party said it was unfortunate that we beat the Soviets in the Cold War, and now he's talking about his affinity for China in the very location where the CCP mowed down student protesters. So this is a horseshoe theory
Is he a
problem.
Tiananmen denialist? It would be funny if he
Someone
was.
should ask him. That's a fair question to ask someone like Piker.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how people who are in positions like that never get asked those types of questions. Let's wrap up with this. There seems to me to be a real conversation going on. I do mean a conversation, not just a fight like what we have seen in the media landscape and affecting places like the Heritage Foundation, things that they've had to deal with. But I think that there really is a conversation happening among younger supporters of Donald Trump about what lessons to take away from all these different things. And I think that actually cuts in some different directions. It isn't necessarily a clear box. And the reason I say that is because, one, so much of the conversation at a high level, meaning the media types and hosts and people like you and me and people who are even more senior, happens through the lens of wars of the recent or not so distant past, and foreign policy decisions that fall into that category as well. So for someone like me, everything is viewed through the lens of what happened on 9/11 and everything that came out of that, because I and my generation of elder millennials were all in high school or college when that happened, and it was life-changing for so many of us, and changed my career, changed my sister's career, got my brother into the military and everything else like that. I think, though, that there's this next generation that has a very different perspective, and they're still figuring it out. And I don't want to judge them too early. We see the indications in some of these polls about them breaking away with conservative tradition when it comes to Israel. We see some of that, when it comes to their dissatisfaction, perhaps about, certain levels of not enough isolationism, a different form of isolationism, whatever you want to call it. But then you also see them, I don't see many of them joining kind of the Rand Paul Thomas Manasseh chorus of saying that the president shouldn't be able to blow drug running boats out of the neutral waters, and so it's not necessarily cutting in the same way that you might expect. What do you see in terms of the conversation among Zoomer right-leaning people right now, and do you think that how do you think that they are forming their ideas about foreign policy generally in this moment? Do you think that it's going to be something that looks more like a traditional conservative approach to the world? Or do they really run the risk of breaking away from, conservative orthodoxies that, tried again to break away from, even someone like Donald Trump has slid back into in so many different respects?
I think a lot of the Zoomers out there have a justified skepticism of American power, which post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan, I think a lot of us actually have that as well. Like I was in 7th grade or 8th grade when 9/11 happened, but still super formative. And I remember that viscerally, but we have a track record that speaks for itself, not all in good ways. But I think there's also this cynicism, not just about American power abroad, but about America here at home.
Yeah.
And those two things coupled together are where you see, I think, a lot of this isolationist-like thought coming from. And I think this is where at some point you can try to persuade or educate as much as you can, but let's acknowledge the obvious here. Core life experiences external to anything that we think really influence us. Like we were just talking about 9/11. That wasn't something like that rationally we decided. Like that catastrophe happened and changed us. COVID was another one of those things, and there's going to be more. And we have no idea what the trajectory of the next generation of Americans on foreign policy is going to be, because it's going to be determined by crises, just as a lot of our history has been, and not just the crisis, but the leadership in that moment who can hopefully unite the country and chart a sober direction. We need that kind of leadership. And I hope that we can get it when those moments inevitably come.
I think that you're right about this. And I also think that one of the things that, when you think about it in terms of humility, if the humility lesson for my generation was about the limits of what you can do to change a regime, but not just a regime, but a people, then I think the humility lesson that has been endured by the Zoomers to this point is witnessing the complete botching and beyond insane in some instances experience that they lived through during COVID. And that is going to make them, I think, more skeptical of America's capabilities in a lot of different respects. And it's going to flow into every area of policy, not just domestic, but foreign as well. Michael Sobolik is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. His book is Countering China's Great Game. You can follow him on X at Michael Sobolik. Michael, thanks so much for taking the time to join the Big Ben Show today.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back to the Big Ben Show. It's been an interesting couple of weeks now as we've been observing the fight going on between ESPN and YouTube TV. It obviously includes the larger Disney networks, but really it's ESPN that people are complaining about, and they're complaining about it because of this ongoing dispute that has ultimately led to a situation where a number of people who've been paying for YouTube TV and for packages that are on it are prevented from being able to watch Monday Night Football, prevented from watching the kind of college games that they'd like to see, and really frustrated by the lack of programming that they believe to be paying for in the first place. One thing that's interesting to me about this, though, is that it seems clear the popularity on this side of things is definitely skewed toward the Google-owned YouTube as opposed to ESPN itself. There are a number of different theories for that. Obviously, a big motivator for ESPN doing all of this is to try to shove people into their new app, which is difficult to use and requires a bunch of different logins and things like that people don't want to have to deal with. But I think that there's something more fundamentally going on here, which is that ESPN is no longer the beloved sports brand that it once was years ago. And that, in fact, the personalities that they have in large part no longer have the kind of connection with the people who are watching the way that they used to. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that. But I do think that this is a situation that they've brought on themselves by providing, quite frankly, subpar programming for a very long time. If you want to hear good analysis of what's going on in so many different team situations or the dynamics about the leagues and different players, you'll actually get them a lot more from podcasts and from private YouTubers themselves than you will from ESPN, which is compromised in so many different ways by the corporate relationships that it has with these leagues. It also is, of course, compromised now by a newly announced deal with DraftKings, getting rid of ESPN Bet, which previously had been Barstool, the Barstool Sports app and Sportsbook, and before that was Penn Gaming. And if you can basically assign the reason that all fell apart, a lot of it has to do with tech, but there are a lot more problems as well. That's not the thing that's as of interest to me. What's interesting to me is to see people basically taking the side of the much bigger company of Google in just because YouTube is a product that's easier to use, that gives people what they want, in the way that they want it, and quite frankly provides better sports analysis than what you're going to see from ESPN these days. From my perspective, this should be a learning moment for Disney, that they need to get better. They need to get better at what they do if they're going to be considered the worldwide leader in sports, as they once were and still claim to be. But I think that would require them to change the formats of their shows, to switch things up in a big way, to not have just scream fests and ridiculous sort of faux activity that between the different anchors and hosts that nobody really believes to be authentic. Feuds that occasionally spill out in public that are real tend to be ones that are driven by race and gender and controversial issues like that. And ESPN is scared of that, quite frankly, because they are so corporately tied in with all of these different leagues and other sponsors and the like. I hope that there's something good that comes out of this in terms of entertaining perhaps younger voices, newer voices, and people who have been laboring away and gaining enormous followings on YouTube via being, frankly, better at their jobs than the people on ESPN are at theirs. I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of The Big Ben Show. You can follow us on X and on Instagram at Big Ben Show Fox. I hope that you will share this podcast with a friend if you like it. Leave a comment, rate and review us, and maybe answer the question for yourself in the comments below. How much do you really miss ESPN if you haven't been able to see it? Do you think you would miss it if it disappeared and you could still get the games that are on it? And maybe even after that Packers-Eagles game the other night, would you even miss the games? I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to The Big Ben Show. We will be back next week with more to dive back into the fray.